Good evening, and welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott, and tonight we'll be returning to the subject of the arts in Chicago, a somewhat unusual art, the art of puppeteering. As our guests tonight, we have several of the principals from Opera in Focus, Justin Snyder, Lelani, Narciso. So thank you so much for being here. It's a pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
We're delighted to be here.
Well, and having recently been to see your production in Rolling Meadows, I have to say I was really impressed and surprised at the sophistication of the presentation. It's quite a show.
Thank you. We appreciate that. You know, we kind of pride ourselves on defying people's expectations of what puppetry is and what puppets can do. So we're always happy when people come to the theater and are able to experience the art form that we practice.
And I suppose I should have introduced the puppets too.
Yes.
When I'm introducing the
Don't
puppeteers.
want to upset them,
right.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Right.
Here we have Lakme from the classic opera Lakme. Beside her here is Count de Luna from Il Trovatore. Next to him we have Mephistopheles from Gounod's Faust. And over here we have a very, very old ancestor of our puppets. This is an original Kungsom puppet from the 1940s here. And we kind of brought her along so people could kind of see the evolution of the puppets from how they used to be back then to how what they've turned into today.
Well, so let's, to use a phrase, set the stage for what we're discussing here. And you've mentioned each of these characters as being from an opera. And
yes.
your company, of course, is Opera in Focus.
Correct.
So talk about the connection between opera and puppets.
Okay. The art form itself, the art form that we practice, dates back to actually the late 1930s in Chicago. And there was a fellow named Ernest Wolfe who was, as a child, he was taken by his relatives to see the opera Carmen. And he fell in love with the art form. So as a kid, he began building...
With opera, with the actual opera.
With the opera, art
actors.
form of opera, correct. So as a kid, he started building really crude, rudimentary puppets at home. And over the years, they became increasingly more sophisticated. And ultimately, his puppets ended up in what a lot of Chicagoans will remember as the Kungsom Miniature Grand Opera. And that was a former McCormick mansion that had been turned into this Kungsom restaurant, which is a Scandinavian restaurant. And the restaurateur, Frederick Kramer, wanted something interesting to put in there to kind of draw people into the restaurant. So when he saw Ernest Wolfe's puppets on stage, he said, I have to have that. That'll be the perfect thing. It's so unusual, you know. So he organized a deal with Ernest Wolfe to have his puppet opera installed in the Kungsom restaurant.
And by installed, that's not just show up and work a couple of puppets.
Yes, it was permanently installed.
Build a stage, lighting, everything, right?
He actually invested almost $500,000 into the actual theater itself, and they had very elaborate. It was exactly what you would expect from a real opera house, just kind of in miniature. And the puppets, Ernest Wolfe's puppets, were at the Kungsom from 1941 through 1971.
And is this over here? This is one of the puppets.
This is one
from
of the original
era.
Kungsom puppets here. They've all been retired now. They kind of live in storage in boxes, but
and that's okay with them.
That's okay with her. You know, she put in her time, and she's happy in her retirement now. So. But after the Kungsom closed in 1971, Bill Foster single-handedly kept the art form alive. Now, Bill started working at Kungsom in 1943, and at that time he was 14 years old. And over the years, he worked on and off at the Kungsom in various different capacities. Ultimately, he was the artistic director of the Kungsom in the 60s. And during his time there, he kind of made a lot of advancements to the puppets, which you can kind of see here. The original Kungsom puppets, they have a mechanism that's kind of similar to ours. They stand on a circular base, and they have controls for the hands and for the arms and for the heads. They have this interesting head-popping mechanism, which our puppets don't have that, but I don't know that they necessarily even need that.
Well, that would only be good for The Exorcist if you were
That's correct,
put that into operatic form, right?
Now, it's interesting because people that used to go to the Kungsom when they were kids, they think back of the puppets as being these huge, elaborate things. And oftentimes when people come to our shows, they'll say, your puppets are so much smaller than the Kungsom puppets. But actually,
they're the same size.
The Kungsom puppets are all between 14 and 15 inches. Our puppets are 16 inches for the adult puppets. So our puppets are actually a little bit taller. The mechanism is a lot more sophisticated on ours, though, and that actually has to do with some of the improvements that Bill Foster made. During the time that the Kungsom was around, there were actually several different types of puppets that they used. This is the very original form here, which you'll notice she doesn't actually even have any legs. the male puppets would have legs, but they weren't articulated at all, so
you couldn't move them at
they would
all.
kind of ice skate on the stage. Whereas you can see from our puppets here, they all have walking mechanisms which enable them to walk. Even the female puppets have legs and walking mechanisms. So over the years, they kind of changed the design of the puppet and modified it as the years went by in order to make them more lifelike and articulated.
So let me segue from that. Lelani, as the stage manager for this opera production, I understand you're the one who cracks the whip and makes everything work behind the scenes. Is that?
Oh, somebody has to.
That's true. Someone does have to. So there's a lot of production values that go into these presentations that you make. So with a little bit of the history and looking at how the puppets move, how tough is it to mount an actual production? What goes into all of that?
Oh, it's actually just like any other theatrical production. We need to have our actors, costumes, set pieces, lighting. There's just countless hours of work go into putting these productions together, and it's really no different than any other live production.
Now, you make much of your own material, right? So these costumes have all been made by the shop that all of you participate in, right?
Correct.
Yes, yeah. Most of our costumes were made by one of the previous puppeteers, Paul Guerra, and he designed and created maybe 80 to 90% of the costumes that we have up until his passing in 2007.
He worked with Bill back at the Kungsholm. Actually, Paul started working there when he was 17. So he had known Bill for many, many years, and when Bill opened Opera and Focus, Paul was his go-to guy for costuming. He was also our principal puppeteer from 1993 till 2006. He was the principal puppeteer of Opera and Focus as well.
So how difficult is it to do all that? I mean, because even with 90% of the costumes made, you have to repair them, you have to make new costumes. I mean,
Yes.
how tough is that?
We can do simple repairs, but for new productions, and we try to premiere new things every year, naturally we're going to need new costumes. And actually that's the only piece that we go outside to have done. Fortunately, we have friends who are talented enough to do these things for us. But other than that, the sculpting and all of that is made in-house.
And so does that mean that all of you have to become essentially sculptors in order to be able to build these puppets?
My brother Shane is our sculptor, so he has the ability to. I have some sculpting ability, but it's very stylized and very rudimentary. Whereas his talent, he's always had the ability to sculpt very lifelike sculptures. So
He was trained in sculpture. I mean, he has.
yes, ever since he was a kid, that was his interest. And growing up, he took a lot of art classes and studied sculpting and things like that. So. When we first started working at the Puppet Opera, Bill Foster noticed his talent and kind of helped foster that and develop his talent on the miniature level of these puppets here. So they all start off as clay sculptures, and he'll sculpt the features in clay, and then it's actually a material called super sculpey, which you can then bake, and that hardens, and then from that he'll make a silicone mold. And then into the silicone mold, he'll pour polyester resin, which is it's an ingredient of fiberglass. And then that's the actual material that we use for most of the puppet parts. Now the hands and the feet, we cast those in lead. And the reason is that they give them more weight. Polyester resin is very, very lightweight, which is good for moving the puppets. But when it comes to making the hands swing naturally when they walk and actually being able to feel what you're doing with the hand, we have to have it a little bit heavier so that we know what's happening. It's interesting that some of our scenes, if there's a lot of set pieces on stage and a lot of puppets on stage, there are situations where you can't actually see what your puppet's doing at all because we're below the stage. So having a little bit of weight in the hands and feet gives us a better idea of what they're actually doing when we're beneath the stage.
Now, and again, that's something I would never think about without hearing about it, that you need some sort of tactile feedback from these puppets to know what they're doing. Right?
The actual manipulation of them is kind of similar to memorizing a complicated musical piece. You can study the notes and you can practice it, but ultimately when you're on stage performing, you want to have it kind of living inside of you somewhere, so that
you can feel it and really
so that you can
it.
actually do the show and do the performance without actually even having to look at them the whole time. Now we try to watch them when we can, and typically if it's a scene that only has a few puppets on stage, you can get a good vantage point. But you in certain situations where it's really crowded on stage and there's a lot going on, you might be stuck behind your puppet, you might be stuck in a weird angle where you can't really see what's happening. So that's when the actual practicing and having kind of the tactile memory of the scene in your body comes into play and enables you to actually do the scene.
And now, having been to your theater, I think one of the most interesting things, as an aside here, is that you also open up the backstage to people who attend these shows, so they can actually see how these things are done.
Correct.
In fact, I want to thank you, Lelani. Actually gave me a lesson. I would say backstage, but it was really understage. You're beneath the stage, working from these sets of controls. And I have to say, it looked like a challenging thing to do.
It can be, yes.
Yeah, in addition to all those controls, to keep in mind the stage is maybe 5 feet wide, so it's very cramped under there to have 4 people, sometimes 5, to actually put together a successful production.
Because there's plenty of room for 5 14-inch puppets on stage, but there are 5 real-size adults underneath.
Exactly.
Right? How do you orchestrate that? What happens underneath then?
Oh, it's a lot of rehearsal. We need
Contortionism.
Right.
Occasional
swearing.
Yeah, fortunately, we're not mic'd under the stage, so. But yeah, fortunately, we have wheels on our stools to kind of help us roll around for seamless walking of the puppets on stage.
It's almost 2 separate rehearsals. One is what's happening above the stage and what's happening below the stage, because you really do have to coordinate exactly where all the other puppeteers are and where your stool is going to be in relation to theirs, so that you don't collide or knock somebody off a stool. And
which I'm sure happens
it has
during
happened.
rehearsal.
Unfortunately,
right?
It has happened.
Even during productions?
During productions, we've had
collisions.
Collisions. We've had chairs just break and you'll just fall on the floor. And it's live theater, though. You kind of just have to roll with it,
or I guess literally roll if you
roll with it
if you fall off your chair.
Yeah.
So how much rehearsal typically goes into a production that you do?
It depends on the complexity of the show. Now, all of our puppeteers have all been there for some years. Now, we have over 115 scenes that we do, and we're always trying to premiere new things. So if it's a scene that we're all very familiar with, that we've all done many times, kind of something like Phantom of the Opera or Hansel and Gretel that we do every year, we can get away with rehearsing a little bit less because we kind of already have an idea of what we're doing. But if it's a premiere or a scene that we haven't done in 10 years or a scene that the newer puppeteers haven't done at all, then we'll have to spend a few more days just working on the mechanics of it. Actually, the first stage of it is just memorizing the libretto, the text of the opera, and memorizing the music, which that can take many weeks leading up to the actual physical rehearsal, just playing the music and studying the text. And they're typically in we have some English language scenes. We try to include at least one in every show, but most of our scenes are either in Italian or German or French, Russian. So you have to kind of study the original language alongside the English translation in order to get an idea of what's happening, what are the puppets saying, and who are they talking to, and what props are they handling, and what are they doing. It's a lot of information that you have to memorize before you even actually get onto the stage.
In fact, as you speak about this, and I remember we talked about this backstage when I visited your production, that there is so much internalization of all of the different movements. In a sense, it becomes almost more effort than if you yourself were a singer on stage.
Definitely, yeah. Well, I think an actual singer on stage doesn't have to think about how they're going to move their arms or their feet as much. They're kind of focused more on just their vocalizing.
And they would move because they just think, I'm going to move my arm this way, as opposed to being a puppeteer where you have to think, how do I turn this to move
How do I
just
make
so?
the body do what I want it to do? And also, we have a little bit of freedom in that real opera singers, when you watch them on stage, they actually don't move that much. They'll kind of come out and they'll pick a spot and they'll stand there for a while and sing. And the reason is that the more movement you do, the more difficult it is for you to sing. Since these puppets are actually singing along with recordings, they have the ability to move a little bit more when they sing. But a lot of it also, the tricky element that we encounter that the live singers probably don't have to encounter as much is turning off our own personalities. For example, if Renata Tebaldi is going to sing Butterfly, she's performing the role of a female character, Whereas if Lelani here is performing the role of Mephistopheles, she has to completely turn off her feminine instinct and her natural ways and get into the mind of this, demonic entity here. So
the devil.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
So we have kind of, we have to kind of leave our comfort zone a little bit more than a regular just vocalist would have to do in order to make the character that we're portraying.